Story 5, A Meeting of the Shadows. Part 3, Blood in the Fog. The streets of Kansas City were cloaked in shadows and fog, the damp March air heavy with the promise of violence. The distant sound of a train horn punctuated the quiet, a mournful reminder of the industrial sprawl that defined the city's edges. The dim glow of gas lamps flickered against the fog blanketing the streets as Detective Beauregard Tecumseh Garwood led the way, his tall, broad frame cutting through the murk as if carving a path into the heart of the city's darkness. Behind him walked his younger brother Augusta carrying a Springfield 1903 rifle, the stock wrapped tightly in a blanket. The group moved like specters, Cosner Davis, Captain Peter Eldridge, Marshal Hayes, and Detective Fitz O'Malley, all trailing in Garwood's wake. The night air was thick with the sour tang of soot and fog as the 6 men moved with purpose through the labyrinthine streets. Each man was driven by a different fire, but they all burned toward the same goal, to confront Johnny Hammer Volcano and put an end to the chaos threatening to consume the city. Their destination was an abandoned railroad siding repair building, rumored to be the staging ground for Hammer's brazen bid to seize control of the city's criminal underworld. Hammer, Fletcher, and the Kelly brothers were key players in the tangled web of power and violence suffocating Kansas City. Tonight, Garwood intended to cut through that web with precision and finality, but the specter of uncertainty loomed over their every step. The stakes had never been higher, and Garwood's mind churned with relentless thought. Hayes had shared everything he had observed during the shadowy meeting between Fletcher, the Kelly brothers, and Hammer. Hayes's voice broke the tense silence as they strode toward the abandoned railroad repair yard. "I followed Fletcher after that meeting," he said, his words low but clear. "He went to a house over in the Northeast District, small place. I tailed him as long as I could, and he met someone there. Young fella. Didn't catch much, but it didn't look good." Garwood's eyes narrowed as the pieces fell into place in his mind. Hayes didn't need to say the address for Garwood to know. The house Hayes had described belonged to Thaddeus Gerard's uncle, the impulsive delivery boy who had become a thorn in Garwood's side. The realization gnawed at him as they walked. Thaddeus, what have you gotten yourself into now? Conflicting thoughts swirled through his mind. Was it desperation that drove him to Fletcher? Revenge for being kept away from Olivia, or something worse, a new alliance forged in hatred? He clenched his fists. It doesn't matter. He's a boy lost in a man's war. The revelation that Fletcher had met with Thaddeus gnawed at Garwood's mind. The boy is a hot-headed, love-struck fool, but he shouldn't know anything that could endanger the plan or the safety of my family. If Fletcher has manipulated him, turned him somehow, it could mean trouble. But Olivia, Katie, and Marie are safe, miles from this city and its poisoned heart. Garwood forced himself to push Thaddeus to the back of his mind. The boy's choices, born of desperation or naivety, were a problem for another day. Tonight, there was no room for distraction. As they passed under a flickering street lamp, Hayes's boots struck the cobblestones with a steady rhythm, though his mind was anything but calm. The fog, thick as smoke, clung to the narrow streets of the city, dimming the gas lights and shrouding the group of men in an eerie twilight. Garwood and Augusta walked a few steps ahead, their strides purposeful, their postures unyielding. Hayes watched them closely, the gears of his mind grinding on a revelation that had been simmering since the first time Eldridge introduced him to Detective Beauregard Tecumseh Garwood, his sharp mind piecing together the fragments of a long-buried puzzle. Back then, when the governor assigned Hayes to Kansas City, Hayes had dismissed the notion almost as quickly as it had entered his mind. The stories of the Garwood brothers had been legend, the stuff of hushed whispers in Nevada saloons over 2 decades ago. Could this Garwood, this middle-aged detective waging war on Kansas City's criminal underworld, be the same man who had once painted the deserts of Eureka County red with the blood of desperate men? The idea seemed far-fetched then. Now, with Augusta walking beside him, a Springfield rifle tucked under his arm, the pieces of Hayes's memories began to fit together. Eureka County had been a place of desperation and danger, the silver boom giving way to a desperate scramble for the last veins of precious metal buried in lead-heavy rock. Hayes had ridden as a hired gun in those days, watching men kill over scraps of ore. But among the tales of greed and violence, one family's name had stood out, Garwood. The stories had spoken of 3 brothers, brutal, cunning, and unrelenting in their pursuit of protecting their father's mining empire. The Garwoods had been ruthless in protecting their mining interests. Stories of the three brothers, each more formidable than the last, had circulated through every card room and saloon. Hayes now realized with certainty that Beauregard and Augusta were two of those brothers. Augusta, the youngest, had been whispered about in awe, said to be the deadliest shot in Nevada, his aim so precise it bordered on the supernatural. He was said to be a ghost with a rifle. The legend of him killing a man from over 650 yards with a Lee Enfield .303 had seemed an exaggeration then, but Hayes wasn't so sure now. Beauregard, Hayes suspected, was the middle brother. The tales spoke of a man who single-handedly killed 14 armed robbers during a botched train heist. Hayes had dismissed it as barroom bravado at the time, but after witnessing Garwood's skill and resolve, the story seemed more plausible with each passing moment. And then there was the oldest brother, a man whose name Hayes couldn't recall, but whose reputation for brutality was the stuff of nightmares. What had become of him? Tales of their brutality and survival had spread like wildfire back then, recounting the lengths to which the sons of Magnus and Garwood would go to defend their father's mining interests. Hayes had once dismissed the stories as exaggerations, but now he could see the truth etched in Garwood's features, the hard lines of a man who had carried violence with him for decades. Hayes's mind lingered on one unanswered question. What happened to the eldest Garwood brother? The stories painted him as a shadow of terror, a man so ruthless that his name alone sent chills through men. Hayes shuddered, but not from the evening air, remembering the tales of a man so ruthless that even the most hardened outlaws avoided crossing him. In the time since his introduction to Garwood, Hayes had let the rumors fade, unsure if they were anything more than campfire tales exaggerated by time and whiskey. But now, watching the brothers move like wolves through the Kansas City fog, he felt certain. These were two of those legendary men, and whether or not every bloody tale was true, Hayes knew one thing with absolute clarity: if you were going to war, having the Garwood brothers on. Your side was better than going up against them. Tonight, with danger swirling unseen in the shadows, Hayes felt a grim satisfaction that these men were his allies. Whatever happened in the hours to come, he was sure of this, there was no one else he would rather have fighting at his side than Beauregard and Augusta Garwood. The tension among the group was palpable as they neared their destination. Augusta's towering frame and quiet demeanor exuded confidence, but Garwood knew his brother well enough to see the storm brewing beneath the surface. Eldridge moved with a sense of purpose, his youthful inexperience tempered by the lessons of recent battles. Cosner, still recovering from his injuries, gritted his teeth with every step, determined to prove his worth despite his pain. O'Malley's labored breathing reminded them all of the wounds that had not yet healed. Every step was a testament to his willpower, his loyalty to Garwood unshakable. As the repair building loomed into view through the thickening fog, Garwood slowed his pace. His keen eyes scanned the shadows, every sense heightened. This was the moment. Tonight, they would take the fight to the heart of the festering corruption strangling the city. But as they closed in, a cold realization settled over Garwood. The enemies they faced were not just the men gathered inside that building, but the deeper, insidious forces of greed, power, and violence that seemed to rise from the city itself. Garwood raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. "This is it," he muttered, his voice low and sharp. As they came to a halt, the skeletal remains of industry looming over them in the dim light. Rusted machinery lay abandoned, and broken windows reflected the faint glow of distant streetlights. The faint murmur of voices drifted from within, accompanied by the metallic clang of a hammer striking steel. Each man steeled himself for what lay ahead. Hayes cast a glance at Augusta, who returned his look with a faint, knowing smirk. O'Malley adjusted his coat, the strain of pain etched across his face. Cosner shifted nervously, his hand hovering near his sidearm. Eldridge, though pale, held his ground, determination flickering in his eyes. They had paused just beyond the perimeter fence of the yard, the fog curling around them like specters of the past. "Gentlemen," Garwood said, his voice low and resolute, "we go in together and we end this, no matter what it takes." The men nodded, their breath visible in the cold air, their determination unshaken. Somewhere in the fog, a church bell tolled, its somber echo a harbinger of what was to come. Garwood turned to Augusta, You know your position?" Augusta nodded, unwrapping the rifle and testing its weight in his hands. "Top floor of the north building," he said. "I'll have a clear view of the whole yard." Garwood turned to the others. "Stick to the plan. We move as one. Don't fire unless I give the signal, and watch your backs. Tonight we finish this." The men exchanged grim nods, their faces etched with resolve. Eldridge adjusted his coat, his knuckles white around the grip of his revolver. O'Malley leaned against a rusted post for a moment, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were sharp with determination. Cosner checked his weapon, the faint tremor in his hands barely noticeable. As they entered the yard, the shadows seemed to stretch and grow, swallowing them whole. Augusta broke off from the group, climbing silently to the upper levels of the north building. Garwood led the others forward, his revolver drawn, his every sense on high alert. From his vantage point, Augusta scanned the scene below, his sharp eyes picking out the flicker of movement. A group of men, Hammer's crew, huddled near a gutted train car. Others walking back and forth from the repair building with rifles slung over their shoulders. Down below, Hayes moved quietly beside Garwood. "This is it," he muttered. "This is it," Garwood echoed, his voice a low growl. The fog thickened, coiling like a living thing around the rusting structures. The distant clang of the hammer rang out again, and Garwood's grip on his revolver tightened. The city is watching tonight, he thought, waiting to see if it can bleed us dry. The fog clung like a shroud as Garwood, Hayes, Eldridge, O'Malley, and Cosner crept toward the looming silhouette of the abandoned railroad siding repair building. Every step reverberated with unspoken tension, each man carrying the weight of the night ahead. Somewhere inside, Hammer was consolidating the remnants of Carlucci's fractured empire, staging his final gambit to seize control of the city's underworld. They moved like shadows, spreading out around the building. Garwood's hand raised into the air, a silent signal to Augusta perched above. From across the yard, Cosner mirrored the motion, his silhouette barely discernible in the dim light. All were in position. The silence was deafening. Augusta settled himself on the rooftop, his Springfield rifle steady in his grasp, its scope trained on the open bay doors. His finger hovered over the trigger as he exhaled slowly, focusing on the figures moving crates below. One shot. That was all it would take to ignite the storm. The crack of Augusta's rifle shattered the silence like a lightning bolt. Before Hammer's men could react, Garwood and his companions surged forward, weapons drawn, bursting into the building from all sides. "Nobody move." Garwood's commanding voice echoed through the cavernous space, amplified by the sheer force of his presence. Inside, chaos froze in an instant. Hammer's 30 men stood momentarily stunned, their weapons still at their sides, looking to their leader for direction. Hammer stepped forward from the shadows, his towering frame radiating defiance. A cruel laugh echoed through the space, mocking and guttural. "You want me to surrender, Garwood?" Hammer sneered, his voice thick with disdain. "How about this? I'll fight you, hand to hand, winner takes all. If I win, you and your boys die right here. If you win, I'll tell my men to stand down." Garwood stared at Hammer, unflinching. The hulking man's bravado was as transparent as his desperation. "Give it up, Hammer. This ends tonight. Behind bars or in a box, you're done." Hammer roared with laughter, raising a hand to signal his men. "Then fight it is!" The room exploded. Gunfire erupted like a thunderstorm, a deafening cacophony of violence. Garwood's revolvers barked, his shots precise and deliberate. Augusta fired from above, the sharp crack of his rifle cutting through the chaos as he picked off targets through the open bay door. Hammer's men scrambled for cover, but the Garwood-led ambush had already thinned their numbers. A dozen fell before they could even draw their weapons. The building became a blood-soaked maze of railcar axles, scattered crates, and broken machinery. The cover provided fleeting protection as both sides exchanged fire. Bullets ricocheted, sparks dancing in the shadows, and the air grew thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder. O'Malley moved to find better cover when a bullet fragment lodged in his body from the night behind the butcher shop shifted violently, severing a nerve. His legs gave out beneath him, and he hit the ground hard. Gritting his teeth, O'Malley clawed his way across the floor with his arms, revolver still clutched in his hand. Shots tore through the air around him, one grazing his shoulder, another ripping into his side. Blood pooled beneath him, but he pressed on, determination etched into his features. Garwood caught sight of O'Malley's harrowing crawl and moved toward him, firing as he went. But Hammer saw him too. The massive figure loomed over O'Malley, his signature weapon, a long-handled hammer raised high. O'Malley, propped against a railcar axle, emptied his revolver into Hammer's chest. The hulking man staggered but did not stop, his momentum carrying him forward as he brought the hammer crashing down on O'Malley's skull. Garwood's revolvers roared, striking Hammer repeatedly, but it wasn't enough to stop the behemoth until he collapsed beside O'Malley's lifeless body. Blood bubbled from Hammer's lips as he let out a wet, gurgling laugh, defiant even in death. Garwood reached O'Malley too late. He knelt beside his partner, forcing himself to look into the mangled features of the man who had fought by his side for years. O'Malley's eyes, once sharp and full of fire, were now dull and lifeless. Garwood burned the image into his memory, a silent vow forming in the depths of his soul. Rising, his voice thundered through the building. "The hammer is dead. Give it up." The gunfire ceased. In the oppressive silence that followed, Garwood's command cut through like a blade. "Throw them down and come into the open, hands raised." Eldridge's voice echoed the order from the far side of the room. One by one, weapons clattered to the ground as the remaining 9 men emerged from their hiding spots, hands in the air, their will to fight broken. The night air was heavy with smoke, sweat, and the lingering taste of gunpowder. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the cold March fog that hung over the railroad siding like a shroud. Garwood, his revolver still hot in his hand, leaned against the rusted frame of a boxcar, his broad shoulders heaving with the exertion of the last few moments. He had watched men die tonight, some by his hand, others by his brother's calculated precision from above, but nothing hit harder than the lifeless form of O'Malley lying in the shadow of a mangled train axle inside the building. Before him, the grim aftermath of the firefight began to take shape. 9 of Hammer's men, their faces pale and slack with fear, knelt in a row on the cold ground, their hands bound tightly with ropes Cosner had scavenged. The bodies of their comrades lay scattered across the floor, their blood pooling beneath the wheels and crates they had used for cover. The once proud remnants of Carlucci's empire had been reduced to a broken, trembling few, their eyes darting around for any sign of hope or salvation. There was none. From the far side of the yard, Eldridge emerged, his face pale and drawn as he approached Garwood. "Where's Fitz?" he asked, his voice trembling under the weight of the question. Garwood said nothing at first, his face carved from stone, but the flicker of emotion in his eyes betrayed the storm raging within him. He merely motioned toward the axle where O'Malley's body lay partially obscured. Eldridge's steps quickened as he reached the spot, dropping to his knees beside his fallen comrade. "Fitz," he whispered, his trembling hand shaking O'Malley's blood-soaked shoulder. The grotesque distortion of O'Malley's features told the tale of his final moments. Eldridge's voice cracked as he looked up at Garwood, his words laden with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Garwood. I know how." Garwood's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with restrained fury. He silenced Eldridge with a look before speaking in a low, controlled tone. "Captain, you and Cosner call this in. Get the department down here. Get the rest of them out of my sight." He glanced at the bound men, who flinched under his glare. "But hurry. Our statements and everything else can wait. We have more work to do tonight. We have to strike before the Kellys know we're coming." Without a word, Eldridge rose and signaled Cosner, who handed his rope to Hayes and followed him into the night, their footsteps echoing faintly in the distance. Garwood remained by the boxcar, his hands moving methodically as he reloaded his revolvers. The act was mechanical, practiced, yet it felt heavier tonight. The weight of loss bore down on his broad frame as he flicked the cylinder shut and holstered his weapon. "Bow!" The voice drew his attention. Augustus stepped out of the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder, the glint of a fresh scrape across the stock catching the dim light. His twisted grin faded as he took in the look on his brother's face. "How many?" he asked quietly. "O'Malley. Everyone else got through no worse for wear," Garwood replied, his voice rough with restraint. Augusta studied his brother, his sharp eyes picking apart every emotion Garwood tried to bury. "Do you want to talk about it?" Garwood shook his head, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. "All I want to talk about is what happens next," he said, his voice a growl of determination. "We can't stop now. Fletcher and the Kellys are still out there." Augusta nodded, his hand resting briefly on his brother's shoulder before stepping away, his sharp silhouette disappearing into the swirling fog. Garwood stood alone for a moment, the silence pressing in around him. The image of O'Malley's lifeless eyes was etched into his mind, burning like a brand. He had lost a friend, a brother in arms, and no amount of victory could erase that. But there was no time to mourn, not yet. The night was far from over, and the bloodshed had only begun. As the distant sound of Cosner and Eldridge's voices returned, Garwood straightened, his resolve hardening like steel. The city wasn't finished taking from him, but tonight he would take something back. With a steady hand, he adjusted his coat, his revolver ready at his side. The Kelly brothers and Fletcher were waiting in the shadows. Let them wait, he thought. I'm coming for them. We are coming for them. The scene inside the repair building was chaos. Patrolmen and investigators swarmed the area, their voices rising and falling in tense murmurs as they cataloged the bodies, restrained prisoners, and collected evidence. The stark light of portable lamps cast long shadows, making the already grim scene feel even more surreal. Amidst the bustle, Captain Eldridge approached Garwood, his expression grave. "Garwood," Eldridge said, motioning him toward the center of the room, "you need to see this." Garwood followed Eldridge's lead, his boots crunching over shattered glass and scattered shell casings. In the center of the room, on a splintered crate, sat a small postal box. It seemed innocuous at first glance, but the grim tension in Eldridge's demeanor told Garwood otherwise. The captain gestured toward the box. "Looks like Hammer and his men were supposed to deliver this. They didn't get the chance before we interrupted." Garwood's jaw tightened as he removed the lid. The smell hit him first, a sickly sweet odor that was unmistakable. Inside, a severed hand clutched a revolver. The sight of it sent a chill racing down his spine, but Garwood forced himself to look closer. The revolver was unmistakable. It was his, a weapon he hadn't seen since the night Carlucci's men had tortured him. His hand trembled for just a moment before his attention shifted to the limb itself. The hand was fresh, the flesh pale and still pliable. It had been severed mere hours ago, but it wasn't the grotesque sight alone that churned his stomach, it was the detail that caught his eye. The radius bone below the cut had a partially healed fracture, the telltale sign of an injury sustained some weeks prior. Garwood's mind raced back to that night, the desperate flight from his apartment building when Thaddeus had hurled himself and Olivia from the window. The boy had broken his arm in the fall. This hand was his. "God," Garwood muttered, his voice a low growl as he turned the revolver over in his hand. His eyes moved to the inside of the box, where words scrawled in blood greeted him with chilling clarity. "You were warned, Fletcher." Garwood's teeth clenched, his knuckles white around the edge of the crate. "We have to go," he growled, his voice sharp and resolute. "Go now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and began to run, his mind already calculating their next move. The city loomed before them, a sprawling beast cloaked in darkness and fog. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound a potential threat. Garwood led the way, his strides purposeful, his revolver back in its holster but his hand ready to draw at a moment's notice. The others followed, their footsteps echoing faintly against the cobblestones. Garwood's thoughts churned like a storm, each one more volatile than the last. "This is what you wanted, isn't it, Fletcher? To drag me back into the darkness, to make me question every choice I've made, every life I've taken? Well, you've succeeded. But I won't let you win. I won't let you take him from me, not like this." The image of Thaddeus's severed hand flashed in his mind, the boy's youthful face juxtaposed with the violent reminder of Fletcher's cruelty. He's just a kid, barely old enough to understand the hell he's been pulled into, and now, because of me, he's paying the price, because I didn't end Fletcher when I had the chance. Guilt clawed at him, but he shoved it aside. Regret wouldn't save Thaddeus. Action would. Garwood glanced over his shoulder at the men following him. Augusto walked a step behind, his rifle ready, his sharp gaze scanning the darkened streets. Eldridge moved with determination, though his face betrayed his inner turmoil. Hayes's jaw was set, the older man steeling himself for what lay ahead. Cosner's eyes burned with a mix of fear and resolve, his hand never straying far from his weapon. They shouldn't have to follow me into this, not again. Every time I drag them into the fight, they come out more battered, more broken. O'Malley's blood is still fresh in my mind, and now Thaddeus. He exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the cold night air. If tonight costs more lives, it'll be on my hands. But if we succeed, maybe, just maybe, we can finally end this. The streets seemed endless, the fog curling around them like the city's malevolent breath. Garwood felt the weight of every step, every decision. His resolve hardened with each passing moment. "Hold on, kid," he muttered under his breath, his words swallowed by the night. "I'm coming for you." Somewhere ahead, in the labyrinth of Kansas City's shadows, Fletcher was waiting. And Garwood knew the price of failure was too high to bear.